Under siege and facing starvation, exclusive Al Jazeera pictures show civilians struggling for survival in Syrian towns encircled by pro-government forces. Can scheduled talks help ease the suffering of those trapped in Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Fighting from within, airstrikes from abroad, and starvation too. Syria's struggling population continues to dwindle as lives are lost to both war and hunger. More than half of all Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance. The United Nations says it's unable to help around 2 million children because they're blocked by fighting or sieged. And in some areas, the price of food has skyrocketed so much, a kilo of rice now costs $100. While civilians are starving in Syria's towns, the international community is kind of stalled on that political solution. Opposition groups this week are continuing meetings in the Saudi capital, which began in December. They're supposed to determine who will attend negotiations scheduled for later this month. The talks aim to prevent Syria's civil war from entering its 6th year. Well, Syrian parents and children continue to desperately protect what little food and medicine they have left. Our reporter, Emike Amulu, has a glimpse of life in a once popular resort town now in ruins. Let's just warn you first, you may find some of the footage in her report to be disturbing.
The people of Madaya and Bakin were promised help. It hasn't come. Shops are empty or closed. On the streets, dejection and despair.
We've only got water. How come there isn't any food? In the end, we were eating starch. Everything has gone.
No one is allowed to leave Madaya. Up to 40,000 people have no food. The situation is extremely bad, to the extent that some people have eaten cats.
In the middle of a winter chill, children are reduced to scrabbling for scraps or picking weeds from the roadside in a desperate attempt to fill tiny plates. Bullets and bombs didn't kill these victims. They starved to death. Humanitarian aid was part of a prisoner swap deal in December. Dozens of Sunni rebel fighters and their families were transported out of the town to Lebanon, headed for Turkey. In exchange, Hezbollah and other Shia fighters were given safe passage out of small towns in northern Syria. Zabadani, northwest of Damascus and close to the Lebanese border, has been the focus of intense fighting. But the rebels lost control of most of the town to the Syrian army. Many residents believe pro-government forces are still blocking supplies.
We've dealt with 150 cases of unconsciousness. People were unconscious because of malnutrition. They hadn't been getting enough food for a number of days.
Medical staff are struggling to help rising number of Syrians suffering from malnutrition. What sound there is on the streets come mainly from children playing or people trying to salvage what they can from remnants of the battles. After months of deprivation, residents had hoped the prisoner swap deal would get them the help they desperately needed. Many are now wondering if it will ever arrive. Emike Amulu, Al Jazeera.
Time to get the discussion going then. Let's bring our guest into the show. Joining me from Amman is Fadi Al-Qadi, human rights advocate and commentator. In Sandhurst via Skype, Wa'il Al-Ajji, spokesman for the Syrian Network for Human Rights. And also in Amman, Mu'in Rabbani, independent Middle East analyst and former head of political affairs for the UN Special Envoy for Syria. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Wa'il, I mean, the pictures which we're seeing coming out of places like Zabadani, they're really shocking, aren't they? What is happening there?
Absolutely. The humanitarian situation in Syria is deteriorating rapidly. And it is not only in those areas. It's not only in Zabadani. It is also in Mu'addamiya and Al-Tal city in Damascus suburbs and Al-Ghouta. The siege on Ghouta has been there for over 2 years now. The situation is so desperate. There is shortage in medical supplies, food and energy supplies, and Assad regime uses sieges and starvation as a weapon. This is a routine practice for Assad regime, and it was used in the past in Homs, for example, and in other areas. Assad uses starvation to force fighters and civilians as well to submit to his conditions.
But have things reached a really low level now? I mean, some of the reports we're hearing is that people are eating insects, wild cats, even plants.
That's absolutely right. There are reports about people dying from starvation and hunger, children, women, elderly people, and we have seen images and video clips about people cooking insects and cats. Absolutely, that's absolutely right, and even eating grass.
Now, Moeen, this is the month in which we're supposed to be heading towards peace talks on Syria. Is there no political momentum building up for even confidence-building measures to address some of the suffering?
Well, I think the problem here is that the humanitarian situation has been completely subordinated to military and political agendas. I mean, if you look at the Syrian conflict, you're basically dealing with parties that either believe that basic international norms should apply only to the other side or shouldn't exist at all. Clearly, despite what the international community and the UN has managed to achieve, it's been far from enough, and this is really a colossal, not only humanitarian and political, but above all moral failure, that you now have a situation where people have been literally starving to death, as in the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp last year, and now these harrowing images we're seeing from elsewhere. And of course, there are other places, because every party considers humanitarian catastrophe a legitimate weapon of war.
But Moeen, usually at this stage in the game, in a conflict, when the two sides are heading towards peace talks, supposedly in just a matter of weeks, you'd expect that there is some political progress on things like ceasefires and truces and, lifting restrictions and sieges. I mean, what is happening politically on those issues?
There has been some movement, but there's also been movement in the opposite direction, where various parties are in fact intensifying their campaigns in order to gain advantage and leverage before these negotiations begin. I also have to say it's very doubtful whether the negotiations will begin on time, and if so, how meaningful they will be, because I still think that what's calling the tune, so to speak, in Syria is a situation on the ground, particularly now the Syrian government offensive supported by Russian air power, in the context of which I think these much vaunted negotiations will, for the time being, remain a sideshow until the situation on the ground is played out and we get a clear impression of where the various parties stand, and on the basis of which we'll have a better understanding of what they're able to impose on the other side or what they're prepared to accept by way of compromise.
Fadi, what's really saddening as well as surprising is that some of these pictures have come out from Zabadani. And Zabadani is an area that only, a few days ago, there was some sort of exchange deal put in place for wounded fighters and some civilians to be let out. How is the easing of the siege not part of these sorts of deals which are being worked out?
Well, I think, as Maureen was saying, there is a sort of like an overwhelming exchange of different kinds of, on different levels of leverages in this situation over here. I mean, you're talking basically about a war, a conflict where every rule of law that we know has been broken in the past 4 years. And, these exchanges, I mean, taking, for example, the Zabadani exchange of prisoners or evacuations, it's really part of that bigger picture of no place for a humanitarian or a human rights-based perspective in this war. You know, as the UN said, I mean, you started this discussion by looking at the confidence or trust building measurements, and in fact, the UN 20 days ago, in the last quarter of December, has exactly said what you just said, is that there is no hope, no practical or political hope that the UN and its international aid partners will be able to deliver whatever, name it, you know, food, energy, supplies, etc., to 4.5 million Syrians unless there are some serious steps in terms of building these trust measurements. And they're not there. They haven't been there for the past 4 years, and they're not happening right now. And whether, you know, there is going to be political negotiations or not, these kind of humanitarian exchanges should not be bounded by political exchanges. In principle, they should go separately. They should consider the essential needs of the population in these areas, whether they are in the pro-regime areas or in the areas that are out of control of the government at the moment. Unfortunately, as you said, it's a very sad situation. The pictures, that we have been seeing in Yarmouk refugee camp a couple of years ago are being repeated in Zabadani, and we really don't have guarantees that we are not going to see similar horrible pictures in the next few months or in the next year.
Moeen, I'm going to come back to you. I'm sure you heard this question in your time with the UN, and it's one that viewers often raise with us as well. They say, why doesn't the UN simply impose a resolution for international intervention to get food into people who are simply starving to death while everyone watches?
Well, the Security Council, in fact, has adopted a resolution some time ago permitting unilateral cross-border deliveries of humanitarian assistance. The reality is that when aid workers are being shot at and bombed, when they try to deliver aid to these stricken areas, they're no longer going to do so, and they will only do so with at least a minimal level of agreement and safe passage from the conflict parties. But I think there's also a wider problem, which Fadi has addressed, is that the political process, particularly in the past year, is being sold in large part as something that will enable the delivery of humanitarian assistance to such areas. Now, in practice, there's obviously a connection between a ceasefire and an ability to deliver these goods. But it also, I think, needlessly and in many cases dangerously politicizes humanitarian aid by making it essentially dependent on first achieving either agreements on the ground in terms of ceasefires, or in terms of achieving political progress.
And on that point, Moeen, this is precisely what we didn't see in some other scenarios where the world said there's simply too much human suffering in places like Srebrenica, potentially Kosovo, and where Chapter 7 was invoked of the UN Charter, and countries came together and said, we're going to intervene internationally without leaving aid workers to struggle between and make that decision. Do they want to go between bombs and rockets to deliver aid? Why not in this scenario?
Well, I think clearly the situation here is one where you have a deeply polarized region, a deeply polarized international community, and a deeply polarized Security Council. I mean, it's virtually inconceivable to think of, for example, European cargo planes, flying over the Russian S-400 missiles to deliver humanitarian assistance to Zabadani, for example. And there are other areas on the government side where that holds equally true. So there is, I think, a very serious political problem here on which you perhaps had more consensus in some of these other situations that you're mentioning.
All right.
But having said that, Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to take the discussion back to Wa'il. A lack of political consensus amongst the members of the Security Council, obviously blocking any progress when it comes to improving humanitarian situation. That's one thing on the one hand, but there was progress, wasn't there, in particular areas, like when we saw the leader of the group, Jaish al-Islam, negotiating a truce for areas in the southern suburbs of Damascus, just before an airstrike kills him. I mean, how do killings like that impact efforts to try and get aid into those areas?
I mean, yes, you are absolutely right, and I agree with my colleagues. I think that the conflict in Syria has become an international issue, especially after the rise of ISIS and other extremist groups. Syria has become a field for international and regional powers to settle their scores. This transformed Syrians, both the regime and the opposition, transformed them to marginal players, actually. So without an international consensus, it is very unlikely that political talks would go forward. There are no trust-building measures, and major players have been reluctant to practice their leverage to put pressure on the regime to engage in serious political talks to ensure transition of power. Yes, the assassination of Zahran Alloush, leader of Jaish al-Islam, was a setback.
My point, though, Wa'il, is, are we seeing tactics? One thing to say that, you know, the world or the Security Council powers can't agree on a sort of plan for military intervention. It's another thing when you see apparently airstrikes conducted by some world powers that seem to be setting back the easing of the siege and the suffering. Why? Is that for deliberate political calculation?
Absolutely. You know, it seems that the Russians, it is not clear to me what the Russians really want from their intervention in Syria. They have been giving all parties conflicting messages. They have been talking about a political solution and transition of power. However, they have been bombarding relentlessly civilian areas and what we call moderate opposition fighters, and ignoring ISIS strongholds. So it is very unclear what the Russians really want, and their actions on the ground contradict what they are saying within the diplomatic and political circles. Now, today, the UN envoy to Syria is meeting with the Syrian opposition in Riyadh. However, the Russians are demanding that the delegation would include so-called opposition figures, but they are actually, we cannot really consider them as opposition. Some of them are clearly pro-regime, such as Qadri Jamil and others. So it is very unclear to me what the Russians really want from their involvement. It is obvious that they are there to stay for a very, very long time.
Okay, I want to pick up. All right, I want to pick up in a minute more on that thought, but on the issue of aid, Fadi, I mean, while that sort of process is going on that Wa'il is explaining, Madaya, for example, hasn't had any aid in for months, and it's been under siege for 200 days. What will happen to the people there if that isn't sorted out soon enough?
Well, we are also in the hardest part of the winter season, as you may know, in this region. So if death does not catch people because of hunger and starvation, it's probably going to catch them, especially the elder and children, because of the cold. And that is a sort of a scary thought. The energy supplies to the region seems to be at zero level at the moment, and there doesn't seem to be any potential for escorting any amount of supplies into that region without a sort of an organized plan and coordinated plan by a sort of like a consistent body. And by that I refer, for instance, to any UN agency that is operating in the region. And I'm not referring necessarily to any sort of like political faction or party in the region. So yes, we're probably talking about another sort of tragic consequence of this sort of prolonged siege on this particular region. But notwithstanding that, it is winter all across Syria, and there are other areas that has been for quite some time deprived from accessing essential food and health and energy supplies. So you're probably talking about a bigger picture and the of problems in the entire Syrian situation. But I want to sort of like go back to the sort of like the possibility of getting into the mood of political negotiations. And I think that this is a sort of like quite an opportunity for putting the humanitarian access again on the agenda. And I just wish that the UN representative, the UN envoy to these negotiations would emphasize that topic one on the agenda should, or make it even a prerequisite to enter into the latter stages of discussions and negotiations, that without moving ahead on the humanitarian access and giving that access a sort of like an organized shape and nature, clear the passages, create practical agreements on points of departure and access, that these negotiations are going to be pointless.
That's a good point. Let's take that to Moeen, because of course you were a UN envoy. How far are the negotiations away from the sorts of preconditions which Fadi was talking about there? Before we start these talks, guys, we've got to improve the situation on the ground for human beings.
Well, of course, the UN can't act independently of the international community, and particularly not independently of the permanent members of the Security Council. Having said that, I think there is a problem of a kind of recalcitrance, hesitation to ruffle feathers, to speak truth to power. To embarrass and shame people where it would be perfectly appropriate to do so. And certainly if you compare the current special envoy to his two predecessors, he seems
Why is that,
almost,
Moeen? This is fascinating. Why is that culture existing?
I don't know what the proper term is. Careerism, opportunism, telling people what they want to hear so that you can keep your job and hopefully go on to bigger and better things. There is that kind of culture within the UN, even more pronounced, unfortunately, at senior levels, where such things would make a difference. Of course, there are prominent exceptions, so I'm by no means trying to generalize, but certainly in my experience, I experience too often of, telling people what they want to hear and making sure you get through the next meeting without antagonism, right, and worry about the consequences later. Now, getting back to your point about these negotiations. Very briefly, because we've got about 15 seconds left. Okay, it's still a long way off. There's still a lot of issues that need to be resolved first, some of which are now being discussed in Riyadh. Right, all right, long way off, and probably we'll be back talking about this again before not too long. Let's thank our guests for now, Fadi Al-Qadi, Wael Al-Ajji and Moeen Rabbani.
And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and all the team, for now, it's goodbye.